The wind shrieked like 1,000 blades tearing through the frozen valley, each gust carrying daggers of ice that sliced against exposed skin. Elra pulled her tattered cloak tighter around her newborn, the tiny, purple-skinned infant making feeble, mewling sounds against her chest. They called this place the Howling Chasm for good reason. The wind never stopped. The snow never ceased. But tonight, the blizzard raged with particular fury. "Hold on, little snowdrop," Laura whispered, her voice trembling as much from fear as from the cold. "Just a little farther." Frostbite had already claimed 2 of her fingers, turning them black and useless. The pain had stopped hours ago, which she knew was the worst sign of all. Laura cradled her child closer, trying to shield the infant from the relentless storm with her own body. Her people had named the baby Cursed, blaming the innocent newborn for the deadly storm that had ravaged their settlement for weeks. A child, born during the worst blizzard in memory, could only be a harbinger of greater suffering, the elders had proclaimed. "She draws the cold," they'd whispered. "She must be sent away." The memory of their faces, fearful, superstitious, cruel, burned in Laura's mind even as the cold burned her flesh. She stumbled forward, her legs numb beneath her, following the dim glow of lights ahead. The community shelter stood like a fortress against the white wasteland, its walls built from the native ice stone that could withstand even the fiercest gales. Elra's heart lifted at the sight. Surely they would not turn away a mother and child on a night like this. Surely they would not condemn her baby to freeze to death, curse or no curse. She pounded her remaining good hand against the thick door, the sound lost in the howling wind. "Please, open the door! My child will die!" After what seemed like forever, a small viewing hatch slid open, revealing a pair of narrowed eyes, the color of frozen berries. "Elder Voss," Elara pleaded, recognizing the community leader. "Please, my daughter needs warmth. She's fading." The elder's gaze fell to the bundle in her arms, his expression hardening. "We're full. Go back." "Back? Back to where? You exiled us," Elra screamed, pushing her face closer to the hatch. "She's just a baby. She's not cursed." The storm follows her. Look around you. Since her birth, it has only grown worse. We cannot risk— "She will die," Laura interrupted, her voice breaking. The elder's eyes showed a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, before hardening once more. "Then that is the will of the ice. I'm sorry. Laura." The hatch slammed shut, the sound of it like a death knell. "No!" Laura screamed, beating against the door until her hand bled. "Please, please!" Only the wind answered, mocking her cries with its endless wail. Desperation clawed at her chest as she turned away from the shelter, frantically scanning the white void for any other option, any other hope. There was nothing but swirling snow as far as she could see. Her foot caught on a hidden ridge of ice, and she pitched forward. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her arms instinctively splaying outward to break her fall. The bundle containing her child slipped from her grasp. She watched in horror as the swaddled infant tumbled away, caught by a violent gust that lifted the small bundle into the air and flung it into the white oblivion. "No!" Laura screamed, scrambling to her feet. But it was too late. Her child had vanished into the storm. "Snowdrop!" She lunged in the direction where her baby had disappeared, but another gust knocked her down again. The snow was getting deeper, the wind stronger. Laura crawled forward, digging frantically through the drifts, her hands bleeding and frozen. "Please," she sobbed, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "Please give her back." But the storm only howled louder, drowning out her pleas, burying her hopes beneath layers of unforgiving white. "Me." Daniel Matthews swore loudly as the snowcat's engine sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in the middle of the alien blizzard. The massive tracked vehicle had been his only protection against the lethal cold of this god-forsaken planet. a place the company had optimistically named New Hope. What a joke that was turning out to be. "Come on, you piece of junk," he muttered, flipping switches and checking readings on the dashboard. The diagnostic screen flashed red warnings. Power anomaly detected. Source, unknown. Distance, 0.8 kilometers northeast. Daniel frowned. Power anomalies usually meant one of two things on New Hope. Either valuable mineral deposits with unique electromagnetic properties, the reason the mining company had sent him here in the first place, or one of the mysterious energy signatures that seemed to emanate from the planet itself. Either way, it was worth investigating, especially since he wasn't going anywhere until he could get the snowcat running again. He pulled on his thermal expedition suit, checking the seals twice before pulling the heavy hood over his head. The suit was rated for temperatures down to minus 70 degrees Celsius, but even with its protection, he'd have maybe 30 minutes before the cold started to become dangerous. Just a quick look, he told himself, securing his emergency beacon to his belt. Find the anomaly, mark it, get back, fix the cat. The moment he opened the hatch, the wind nearly tore it from his hands. Daniel stepped out into the storm, the wind hitting him like a physical blow. He activated his navigational HUD, watching as the arrow pointed northeast toward the anomaly. Keeping his head down, he began trudging through the snow, each step an effort against the gale. 20 minutes later, the HUD indicated he was almost on top of the anomaly, but Daniel could see nothing but swirling white in every direction. He swept his scanner in a wide arc, trying to pinpoint the exact location. The reading grew stronger as he moved toward a large drift. That's when he heard it. So faint he thought he'd imagined it at first. A sound that didn't belong in this frozen wasteland. A cry. A baby's cry. "What the hell?" Daniel muttered, shaking his head. The isolation was getting to him. There couldn't possibly be a child out here. But as he listened, the sound came again, unmistakable even through the howling wind. Daniel dropped to his knees and began digging through the snowdrift frantically. His gloved hands struck something soft. He brushed away more snow, revealing a bundle wrapped in some kind of fibrous material. The bundle moved slightly, and another feeble cry emerged from within. "Oh my God," Daniel breathed, carefully lifting the bundle, pulling back the wrapping. He found himself staring at a tiny infant, but not a human one. The baby's skin was a soft lavender color, with delicate ridges along its temples and a fine dusting of what looked like frost crystals across its scalp. Its eyes, when they fluttered open briefly, were the color of Arctic ice. The baby was barely moving, its small body dangerously cold to the touch. Daniel didn't hesitate. He tucked the infant inside his thermal suit, against his chest, and activated his emergency beacon. The mining outpost was closer than his disabled snowcat, and the baby needed warmth immediately. "Hang on, little one," he said, turning into the wind. "I've got you." The trek back was hellish. The wind seemed determined to push him backward, and the cold seeped through his suit faster than he'd anticipated. But the small weight against his chest gave him purpose, drove him forward when his body screamed at him to stop. By the time the lights of the outpost appeared through the blizzard, Daniel's extremities had gone numb, and his vision was starting to blur. He stumbled the last few meters to the airlock, falling through as it cycled open automatically in response to his beacon. Warm air rushed over him as he collapsed onto the floor of the entry chamber, carefully cradling the bundle against his chest. "Matthews! What the hell happened to you?" The outpost medic, Yara Okafor, was already kneeling beside him, her dark eyes wide with concern. Daniel carefully extracted the infant from inside his suit. "Found a baby in the storm. Not human. Needs help." Yara's professional composure slipped for just a moment as she stared at the purple-skinned infant. Then her training took over. "Medbay, now." In the sterile warmth of the outpost's medical facility, Yara worked quickly, placing heat pads around the tiny body and hooking up monitoring equipment calibrated for the planet's native species. They'd encountered the indigenous humanoids before, mostly from a distance, as the xenobiology team tried to respect their territorial boundaries, but never one so young. Core temperature is dangerously low, Yara reported, administering a carefully measured dose of nutrient slurry designed to be compatible with the alien physiology. But heart rate is stabilizing. These little ones are remarkably resilient. Daniel watched, still shivering himself despite the thermal blanket draped around his shoulders. Will the baby survive? Yara nodded cautiously. I think so. A few more hours out there, though. She didn't need to finish the thought. What about the parents? She asked. Were there any adults nearby? Daniel shook his head. Nothing. Just the baby, buried in a snowdrift. I don't know how long it had been there. Well, someone out there is missing their child, Yara said, gently stroking the infant's frost-covered scalp. The crystals, they'd discovered, were a natural feature of the species, not actual ice. We should alert the xenobiology team. Maybe they can make contact with the nearest settlement. Daniel nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the tiny being on the medical table. Something about finding this child in the storm felt important in a way he couldn't articulate. After 3 years on this frozen rock, drilling holes and taking samples and sending reports back to a company that cared only about profit margins, he'd finally found something that mattered. I'm going back out, he announced suddenly. Yara looked up sharply. Are you insane? You nearly died of exposure. The storm's getting worse. There might be someone else out there. A parent. I can't just... He gestured helplessly at the baby. I can't leave them to die. Yara wanted to argue, but the determination in Daniel's eyes stopped her. Instead, she helped him into a fresh thermal suit and pressed a medical beacon into his hand. 2 hours. That's all your body can take after what you've just been through. If you're not back by then, I'm sending out a rescue team. Daniel nodded, his gaze lingering on the small purple form on the medical table. Take care of her until I get back. Her? Yara raised an eyebrow. Daniel shrugged. Just a feeling. The storm had indeed worsened in the short time he'd been inside. Daniel retraced his steps as best he could, using the navigational data from his earlier trek to guide him back to where he'd found the baby. The wind screamed around him, ice particles stinging any exposed skin. Visibility was down to mere meters. He activated his scanner again, searching for any sign of life, any heat signature that might indicate another being trapped in the storm. For nearly an hour, he found nothing, and his hope began to fade, along with the feeling in his extremities. Then his scanner beeped, a faint heat signature just at the edge of its range. Daniel changed course, pushing against the wind toward the reading. As he drew closer, he could make out a dark shape in the snow, partially buried. It was a figure, curled into a fetal position, nearly covered by drifting snow. Daniel rushed forward, brushing away the snow to reveal a female of the same species as the infant. Her purple skin had taken on a dangerous grayish tinge, and her limbs were stiff with cold. Frost crystals, similar to the baby's, covered her head, though hers were longer, more elaborate. Hey, can you hear me? Daniel shouted over the wind, shaking her shoulder gently. There was no response. He checked for a pulse, finding it weak but present. She was alive, barely. Without hesitation, Daniel lifted her in his arms. She was surprisingly light despite being nearly as tall as he was, and began the arduous journey back to the outpost. By the time he staggered through the airlock for the second time that day, Daniel was at the limits of his endurance. Yara and 2 other staff members rushed to help, taking the unconscious alien woman from his arms and hurrying her to the medical bay. Daniel followed, his legs barely supporting him. In the med bay, they placed the woman on a table adjacent to the infant, who was now awake and making soft cooing sounds. Yara and her team worked quickly, applying heat pads and administering emergency treatments designed to combat severe hypothermia in the native species. "Is she going to make it?" Daniel asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. Yara's expression was guarded. "Hard to say. She's been exposed much longer than the little one. There's significant frostbite damage to her extremities." She nodded toward the woman's hands, where several fingers had turned black. "But she's fighting." As if in response to Yara's words, the woman's eyelids fluttered. Her eyes, when they opened, were the same ice blue as the infant's. She looked around in confusion, then tried to sit up, making a distressed sound when her body refused to obey. "Easy," Yara said soothingly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're safe. You need to rest." The woman's gaze darted around the room, fear evident in her expression. Then her eyes fell on the infant in the adjacent bed, and she made a sound that needed no translation, a mother's cry of recognition. She reached out a damaged hand toward the baby, desperation in her movements. Daniel moved to the infant's side and carefully lifted the small bundle, bringing her close enough for the mother to see. "She's okay," he said, though he knew the woman probably couldn't understand his words. "Your baby is okay." Tears welled in the woman's eyes as she looked from her child to Daniel. She said something in her language, a musical series of sounds unlike anything Daniel had heard before. Though he couldn't understand the words, the gratitude in her voice was unmistakable. "You're welcome," he replied softly. After a moment's hesitation, he carefully placed the infant in the crook of the woman's arm. The baby immediately nuzzled closer to her mother, making contented sounds. The woman's damaged hand came up to stroke the baby's head, her touch infinitely gentle despite her injuries. She looked up at Daniel again, studying his face with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "I'm Daniel," he said, touching his chest. "Daniel." The woman seemed to understand the gesture. She touched her own chest with her less injured hand. "Lura," she said, her voice like wind through ice crystals. "Lura," Daniel repeated, smiling. "And what about this little one?" He gestured to the baby. Ulra looked down at her child, her expression softening. She made a series of sounds that Daniel had no hope of reproducing. "I've been calling her Snowdrop," he admitted. "Found her in a snowdrift." Elra tilted her head, considering. Then, to his surprise, she nodded and repeated, "Snowdrop," her accent making the word sound almost musical. A bond, fragile as a snowflake but just as perfect, formed between them in that moment. Human, alien mother, and the child they had both fought to save. For 3 days, Elra and Snowdrop recovered in the outpost's medical bay. Yara had been forced to amputate 2 of Elra's fingers that had been too severely damaged by frostbite, but she was otherwise healing well. The baby was thriving, showing no ill effects from her time in the storm. Daniel visited them frequently, bringing small gifts, extra blankets, a stuffed toy one of the engineers had made from spare fabric, a data pad with images of flowers from Earth that seemed to fascinate Lara. He found himself drawn to them, to this small family so far from his own. On the 4th day, as Daniel sat beside Lura's bed, showing her how to use the data pad, an alarm sounded throughout the outpost. Moments later, Yara burst into the room, her expression tense. "We've got company," she said to Daniel. "A group of natives approaching from the northeast. They don't look friendly." Daniel stood, moving instinctively between Lara and the door. "How many?" "About a dozen. They're armed with some kind of spears or staffs. Security wants to know how to proceed." Before Daniel could respond, Lara spoke. She had been picking up English words quickly, though her grammar was still fragmented. "My people," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Come for Snowdrop. Say she cursed. Blame Storm." Daniel's expression hardened. "They're the ones who left you both to die in the blizzard." Elra nodded, clutching her baby closer. Elder say storm follow Snowdrop. Say she must go. Go where? Into the storm to die? Daniel felt a surge of anger, unlike anything he'd experienced before. That's not happening. He turned to Yara. Tell security to let them approach, but no one fires unless fired upon. I want to talk to them. Yara nodded and left to relay the instructions. Daniel looked back at Lara, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and hope in her ice-blue eyes. They won't take her, he promised. I won't let them. He helped Ulra into a chair near the window, where she could see the approaching group without being immediately visible to them. Then, he went to meet the outpost's security chief at the airlock. The aliens were allowed into the outer chamber in groups of 3, as the airlock couldn't accommodate more. Their appearance was similar to Laura's, tall, with purple skin and crystalline growths on their scalps, though these varied in pattern and complexity. They wore thick furs and carried staffs tipped with what looked like sharpened crystals. The leader stepped forward, his frost patterns elaborate and his bearing regal. He spoke in the same musical language Laura used, gesturing emphatically. I'm sorry. I don't understand, Daniel said, keeping his voice level despite the tension in the air. The leader frowned, then motioned to a younger member of his group, who stepped forward. To Daniel's surprise, this one spoke in halting English. We come for child and mother, he said. They belong with us. Daniel crossed his arms. The child and mother you left to die in the storm? Those ones. The translator conferred briefly with the leader, then turned back to Daniel. Child brings storm. Bad omen. Must be sent away. She's an infant, Daniel said incredulously. She doesn't control the weather. And even if she did, you condemned her to death. What kind of people sacrifice babies to appease their superstitions? The translator's expression darkened as he relayed Daniel's words. The leader stepped forward, speaking forcefully and pointing toward the interior of the outpost. We take them now, the translator said. They are people, not yours. You lost that right when you closed your doors to them, Daniel replied, his voice cold. You left them to die, now they're mine to protect. The leader raised his staff threateningly, but Daniel didn't flinch. The security chief beside him raised his weapon in response, creating a tense standoff. Enough! The voice came from behind them. Laura stood in the doorway, Snowdrop cradled in her arms. She looked different now, stronger, more determined than the half-frozen woman Daniel had rescued from the snow. She spoke to her people in their language, her voice ringing with authority that needed no translation. When she finished, she switched to her limited English for Daniel's benefit. I tell them you save us. I tell them Snowdrop no bring storm. Storm always come this season. They know this. They fear because Snowdrop different, born with brighter crystals. She touched her baby's head, where the frost formations did indeed seem to shimmer more brilliantly than those of the adults. The leader responded angrily, gesturing at the baby. Elra stood her ground, responding with equal force. The exchange continued for several minutes, with the group of aliens growing increasingly agitated. Finally, Elra turned to Daniel. They say I must return. Say Snowdrop belong to community. Say if not return, they attack outpost. Daniel's jaw tightened. We can defend ourselves if necessary. You don't have to go back to people who would let your child die. Elra studied his face for a long moment, then looked down at her baby. When she raised her eyes again, there was resolve in them. I go back, she said. But not stay. I show them. Show them Snowdrop special, not cursed. Daniel wanted to argue, but something in Lara's expression stopped him. This was her decision to make. I'm coming with you, he said instead. She nodded, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Yes, together. The journey to Elra's village took several hours through the endless snow. The storm had abated somewhat, though the wind still bit at any exposed skin. Daniel stayed close to Elra and Snowdrop, his hand never far from the weapon concealed beneath his thermal coat. The village, when they reached it, was unlike anything Daniel had seen before. Structures carved from the native ice stone rose like frozen waves from the snow-covered ground, their surfaces etched with intricate patterns that matched the crystalline growths on the inhabitants' heads. Despite the beauty of the architecture, there was a coldness to the place that had nothing to do with the temperature, a sense of rigid order that left no room for deviation. As they entered the village, the inhabitants emerged from their dwellings to stare. Daniel heard whispers, saw pointing fingers and hostile glares directed at both him and the baby in Lura's arms. He moved closer to them protectively. The procession continued to the center of the village, where a large circular structure stood. Inside, a council of elders waited, seated on raised platforms of ice. Their frost patterns were the most elaborate Daniel had seen, denoting their status within the community. The leader who had come to the outpost stepped forward, addressing the council. The translator murmured to Daniel, "He tells them we found cursed child and outcast mother. Says you, human, interfere with our ways." Daniel bit back a retort, watching as one elder in particular, older than the rest, with frost patterns that had begun to droop with age, leaned forward with interest. This, he guessed, was the one who had made the final decision to exile Lura and her child. Ulra stepped forward before anyone could stop her. She stood tall, her baby held high for all to see. Then she began to speak, her voice ringing through the chamber. Though Daniel couldn't understand her words, the passion behind them was clear. She was defending her child, challenging their beliefs, demanding recognition. The elders' expressions ranged from outrage to discomfort, to, in a few cases, shame. When Lura finished, silence fell over the gathering, heavy as new snow. Finally, the oldest elder spoke, his voice reedy with age. The translator whispered, "He asks why human interferes in our matters. Says you should give back what is not yours." Daniel stepped forward to stand beside Lura. "Tell him I found a child abandoned in a snowstorm," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "Tell him I found a mother left to die for protecting her baby. Where I come from, we don't throw away lives based on superstition and fear. We protect those who need protection." As the translator relayed his words, Daniel placed a hand on Lura's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that drew gasps from the assembled villagers. Contact between their species was rare, and clearly viewed with suspicion. The elder responded, his tone dismissive. The translator hesitated before saying, "He says you don't understand our ways. The child brings the storms that kill our people. The sacrifice of one saves many." "Sacrifice," Daniel repeated, his anger rising. "You call leaving an infant to freeze to death a sacrifice? That's not sacrifice, that's murder." Before the translator could relay this, Elora spoke again, her limited English strained but clear enough. "My daughter Miracle, not curse. Look." She unwrapped Snowdrop partially, revealing the baby's frost patterns. They gleamed in the diffuse light, filtering through the ice walls, brighter and more intricate than any adult's. As they watched, the patterns seemed to shift slightly, responding to the baby's contentment in her mother's arms. A murmur ran through the crowd. One young girl, her own frost patterns scarred and damaged, pushed forward to see better. When she reached out a hesitant finger toward the baby, Laura allowed the touch. The moment the girl's finger met Snowdrop's head, her own damaged patterns seemed to brighten slightly. The girl gasped, looking up at her elders with wonder. "Warm," she said in her own language, the word similar enough that Daniel understood it. "Not cold, warm." More villagers pressed forward, wanting to see, to touch. The elders watched in consternation as their narrative of the cursed child crumbled before a simple truth. Snowdrop was not bringing death, but light and warmth. The old elder rose slowly from his seat, leaning heavily on a staff of crystal-tipped ice. He approached Elra, his expression unreadable. When he reached her, he bowed his head slightly, a gesture that caused another ripple of surprise through the gathering. He spoke directly to Lara, his voice too quiet for the translator to catch. Whatever he said made Lara's eyes widen, then narrow in determination. She responded with a single word that needed no translation. No. With that, she turned away from the elder, from the council, from the village that had rejected her and her child. She looked at Daniel, a question in her eyes. "Ready when you are," he said softly. Together, they walked out of the chamber, through the village, and back into the waiting snow. Behind them, whispers followed, but no one moved to stop them. The old beliefs had been challenged, and though they wouldn't change overnight, a seed of doubt had been planted. As they reached the edge of the village, Lara paused. From within her clothing, she withdrew a small object, a woven charm made from some kind of fibrous material. She pressed it into Daniel's hand, closing his fingers around it. "Family," she said simply. "You family now." Daniel looked down at the charm, then back at Lara and Snowdrop. In that moment, standing at the border between two worlds, he made his choice. "Let's go home." Ja. The human colony on the southern continent was a stark contrast to the icy settlements of Elra's people, built within a massive geothermal cave system. It was a riot of color and noise and warmth. Hydroponics gardens flourished under artificial sunlight, creating patches of green amid the industrial structures. Children played in communal areas, their laughter echoing off the cave walls. Daniel had pulled every string, called in every favor, and made promises he wasn't sure he could keep to secure housing for Lara and Snowdrop. The colony administrator, a stern woman named Director Eliza Huang, had finally relented, partly out of scientific curiosity about having members of the indigenous species living within the colony, partly because Daniel had threatened to resign otherwise. "This housing unit is temporary," she reminded him, as they stood outside the small, prefabricated structure that would serve as LRA's new home. 3 months. After that, we reassess based on integration success and security considerations. Daniel nodded, though privately he had no intention of letting Lara and Snowdrop go anywhere after 3 months, unless they wanted to. "Understood, Director. Thank you for the opportunity." Huang gave him a knowing look. "Don't make me regret this, Matthews. These are the first of their kind to live among us. If anything goes wrong—" "It won't," Daniel assured her. "Elara wants to learn, to be part of the community, and Snowdrop is just a baby. She'll grow up knowing both cultures." Huang's expression softened slightly at the mention of the infant. Even she wasn't immune to Snowdrop's charm. "Just keep me updated. Weekly reports on their adjustment, health, language acquisition, the works." After she left, Daniel spent the day helping Elra settle into her new home. The unit was basic, a living area, a small food preparation space, a sleeping room, and sanitation facilities. But it was warm and safe, with thick walls to retain heat for the cold-adapted aliens. "Home," Elra said, touching the walls wonderingly as she explored the space. Her English had improved dramatically in the weeks since their confrontation at the village, though she still struggled with complex sentence structures. "It's not much," Daniel apologized, suddenly seeing the stark utilitarian space through her eyes. Elra shook her head, smiling. "Is perfect. Is safe for Snowdrop." She looked down at the baby in her arms, who was awake and looking around with bright, curious eyes. The infant's frost patterns had continued to develop, growing more complex and luminous by the day. Daniel cleared his throat, suddenly awkward. "I should let you rest. It's been a long journey. My quarters are just 2 blocks away. I've programmed the location into your comm unit. If you need anything, day or night, Just call." Ilra stepped closer to him, her ice-blue eyes searching his face. "You saved us," she said softly. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. He'd never really examined his own motivations, acting instead on instinct and emotion. "I couldn't leave you out there," he said finally. "It was the right thing to do." Ilra continued to study him, as if his answer hadn't satisfied her. "Many humans here. Many years. None helped my people before." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't wrong. The human colony had been established nearly 15 years ago, and while there had been occasional contact with the indigenous population, there had been little meaningful interaction. The company that funded the colony was interested in resources, not cultural exchange. "I guess I've never been very good at following the rules," he said with a wry smile. "And I've never understood treating people, any people, as if they don't matter." Ilra nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had suspected. Then, to his surprise, she reached into a pouch at her waist and withdrew another woven charm, similar to the one she had given him at the village but more elaborate. She pressed it into his hand. "In my people tradition, give charm to family," she explained. "First charm, choose family. Second charm, seal bond." She closed his fingers around the token, her touch lingering. "You, Daniel. Ila Ra. We family now." Something tightened in Daniel's chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I'm honored," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Truly." After he left, Daniel stood outside Lyra's door for a long moment, the charm warm in his hand. In his 3 years on New Hope, he'd never felt truly connected to this place or its people. He did his job, collected his pay, and counted the days until his contract ended and he could return to Earth. Now, suddenly, the thought of leaving filled him with a sense of loss. He looked down at the charm, its woven pattern reminding him of the frost formations on Laura's head. "Family," he murmured to himself. It had been a long time since he'd had one of those. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Daniel would work his shifts at the mining operation, then spend his evenings with Ilra and Snowdrop, teaching them English and learning snippets of their language in return. He brought them to the colony's communal gardens, introduced them to other residents, helped Ilra navigate the complexities of human society. There were challenges, of course. Some colonists viewed the aliens with suspicion or outright hostility. Others were too curious, treating Lyra and Snowdrop as exotic specimens rather than people deserving of respect. Director Huang watched their integration with a critical eye, ready to revoke their residency at the first sign of trouble. But there were moments of profound connection too. The day Lyra first tasted chocolate and declared it good like Snow Night feast, her eyes wide with delight. The evening Daniel spent hours carefully helping her craft traditional frost pattern designs on the walls of her quarters, using special paints that mimicked the crystalline shimmer of her people's decorations. The morning Snowdrop reached for him with tiny hands, cooing in a mixture of human and alien sounds. Snowdrop grew quickly, as children of her species apparently did. Within 2 months, she was crawling enthusiastically around the living unit, her frost patterns changing subtly to reflect her moods, brighter when happy, more subdued when tired or cranky. Daniel found himself mesmerized by these changes. By the way, she was developing a personality that seemed to blend Ilra's quiet determination with a curiosity all her own. One evening, as Daniel sat on the floor of Lyra's quarters, watching Snowdrop practice pulling herself up to standing, Lyra asked the question he'd been both expecting and dreading. "When you leave New Hope?" Daniel looked up, startled. "What makes you think I'm leaving?" Ilra gestured around them. "Humans here. Then go. Back to Earth. You tell me. Contract 3 years. 3 years almost done." He'd forgotten mentioning that to her. I don't know, he admitted. The truth was, his contract would expire in less than a month, and he hadn't yet decided whether to renew it. Before meeting Elra and Snowdrop, the answer would have been simple. Pack up and head back to Earth, away from this frozen world with its endless storms. Now, the decision felt impossibly complex. You want go home? Laura asked, her tone carefully neutral, though Daniel thought he detected a hint of sadness beneath the words. I'm not sure where home is anymore, he said honestly. Earth doesn't feel like home, hasn't for a long time. But this place... He trailed off, unsure how to explain the restlessness that had driven him from planet to planet, job to job, never quite finding where he belonged. Elra nodded as if she understood. Home, not place, she said softly. Home people. Before Daniel could respond, Snowdrop let out a delighted squeal. She had managed to pull herself up using the edge of a storage container and was now standing unsteadily, her frost patterns gleaming with pride and excitement. Look at you, Daniel exclaimed, holding out his hands to her. You're standing all by yourself. Snowdrop bounced slightly on her chubby legs, grinning. Then, to both adults' amazement, she let go of the container and took one wobbly step toward Daniel. Then another, a third. She's walking, Daniel gasped. Lil Ra, she's walking! Ulra moved to kneel beside him, her eyes wide with wonder and pride. So soon. My people children usually walk later. Snowdrop took one more determined step, then pitched forward. Daniel caught her before she could fall, lifting her high in the air as she giggled. You brilliant girl, he praised. You amazing, incredible, brilliant girl. As he lowered her, Snowdrop reached out and patted his cheek with a small purple hand. Then, in a voice clear as a bell, she said, Pa. Daniel froze, his heart suddenly hammering in his chest. He looked at Laura, who appeared equally stunned. Did she just... Pa, Snowdrop repeated firmly, patting his face again. Pa. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. I think she's trying to say Papa, he whispered. Ulray's eyes filled with tears. She chose you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. As family, as father. Daniel looked from Snowdrop's beaming face to Lura's tear-filled eyes, feeling something shift and settle inside him. All his life, he'd been searching for something, moving from place to place, never finding what he was looking for. Now, in this small, prefabricated unit on a frozen alien world, with a purple-skinned baby calling him Pa, and her mother watching him with eyes the color of Earth's clearest skies, he finally understood what he'd been seeking. I'm not leaving, he said suddenly, the decision crystallizing in that moment. I'm staying right here, with both of you. Ulra's eyes widened. Truly? Truly, Daniel confirmed, his voice steady with certainty. You were right. Home isn't a place, it's people. It's family. And you and Snowdrop are my family now. Elra's face bloomed with joy. She moved closer, resting her forehead against his, in a gesture he had learned was deeply significant in her culture, a sign of complete trust and acceptance. Together, she murmured. Family. Family, Daniel echoed, holding Snowdrop between them, her small form a bridge connecting their two worlds. Spring, such as it was on New Hope, arrived with subtle changes. The deadly storms became less frequent, the winds less biting. In protected valleys, native plants emerged from beneath the snow, their crystalline structures catching the wan sunlight in prismatic displays. Daniel had renewed his contract for another 3 years, accepting a promotion that allowed him to spend more time in the colony and less in the field. Director Huang, after observing Lura's successful integration for 3 months, had granted her permanent residency status, even offering her a position in the xenobiology department as a cultural consultant. Today, for the first time since they'd arrived at the colony, They were venturing outside the protective cave system. Daniel had discovered a sheltered valley not far from the colony entrance, where the spring growth was particularly vibrant. He thought Ulra and Snowdrop might enjoy seeing something of their planet's beauty after months confined to the human settlement. "Are you sure this is safe?" Ulra asked, as they suited up in the airlock chamber. Though New Hope's spring was milder than its winter, the temperatures were still dangerously low for humans, and uncomfortable even for the native species. "Completely safe," Daniel assured her, helping her adjust Snowdrop's small protective suit. "I've checked the weather patterns obsessively. No storms for at least 2 days, and we'll stay within sight of the colony entrance." Elra still looked apprehensive, but nodded. She had been working hard to overcome her fear of the open snow, a legacy of her near-death experience in the blizzard. For Snowdrop's sake, she wanted to embrace all aspects of their heritage, including their planet's natural environment. The airlock cycled open, and they stepped out onto the surface. The sky above was a pale lavender, the closest New Hope ever came to blue, with thin clouds streaking across it like delicate brushstrokes. The snow underfoot sparkled with ice crystals that refracted the sunlight into rainbow patterns. Snowdrop, now nearly 8 months old and walking confidently, stared wide-eyed at the vast open space around them. She had no memory of the world outside, having spent her brief life first in her mother's village and then in the human colony. "Snow," Elra said, kneeling beside her daughter and scooping up a handful of the glistening powder. "Your namesake, little one." Snowdrop reached out tentatively to touch the snow, then giggled as it dissolved against the warmth of her suit. She immediately bent down to grab more, fascinated by the new substance. Daniel led them along a carefully plotted path to the valley he had discovered. As they crested a small ridge, the view opened up before them, a stretch of protected land where crystal flowers had emerged from beneath the snow, their translucent petals catching the light like living prisms. The effect was breathtaking, a garden of light dancing across the snow. "Oh," Lura breathed, her eyes wide. "I forgot how beautiful." Snowdrop squealed with delight, toddling forward to examine the closest crystal flower. When she touched its delicate petal, the flower seemed to respond, its prismatic colors shifting slightly to match the patterns on her head. "Look at that," Daniel murmured, fascinated. "They're responding to her." All around them, the crystal flowers were subtly changing, their colors shifting in waves that followed Snowdrop's movements. It was as if they recognized something in her, some resonance that connected them. Elra watched, tears forming in her eyes. "Elder was right," she said softly. Daniel looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "Last words Elder say to me, in village." Lura's gaze remained fixed on her daughter, who was now sitting among the crystal flowers, laughing as they changed colors around her. "He say, she not cursed, she blessed. Too much power for us to understand. He know, Daniel. He know she's special." Daniel followed her gaze to Snowdrop, whose frost patterns were glowing brighter than usual, seeming to communicate with the living crystals around her. "Special how?" Elra shook her head. "Not know yet, but she connected to planet, to crystals. My people believe crystals hold soul of world. Maybe Snowdrop speak to that soul." It was beyond Daniel's scientific understanding, but he couldn't deny the evidence before his eyes. Snowdrop was interacting with the native flora in a way that seemed impossible, yet was happening nonetheless. "Whatever she is, whatever she can do," he said firmly, "we'll help her understand it, together." Elra nodded, reaching for his hand. Her fingers, including the ones Yara had been forced to amputate, twined with his, different in color and texture, but fitting perfectly nonetheless. "I afraid, when lose her in storm," Lura admitted. "Most afraid ever been. Think she gone forever. Then you come." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "I'm glad I was there. I'm glad I found her." Found both of you." They stood together, watching as Snowdrop played among the crystal flowers, her laughter carrying on the crisp air. Above them, the pale lavender sky was clear of storms, at least for now. Beyond the ridge, the human colony buzzed with activity, a bastion of warmth and technology against the planet's harsh conditions. And farther still, across the frozen wastes, LRA's village continued its ancient ways, perhaps a little less rigid, a little more open to change after what they had witnessed. Two worlds, not yet fully bridged, but connected now through the bonds of a family forged in ice and storm. A mother who had defied her people's superstitions to protect her child. A human who had followed a power anomaly and found his purpose. And between them, a child whose existence challenged boundaries and whose future held possibilities neither of them could yet imagine. As the day's weak sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the crystal flowers in deepening hues of purple and gold, Daniel put his arm around Lyra's shoulders. Snowdrop looked up from her play, saw them standing together, and came running on sturdy legs, her arms outstretched. "Ma, Pa!" she called, her voice clear in the still air. Daniel scooped her up as she reached them, lifting her high so she could see the valley spread out below. Lyra stepped closer, completing their circle, her arm slipping around Daniel's waist. In that moment, standing together under the alien sky, they were more than survivors of a storm, more than refugees from different worlds, more than cultural curiosities or scientific anomalies. They were simply what Elra had named them months ago, what Snowdrop confirmed with her innocent words, what Daniel had finally found after years of searching. Family. And as the crystal flowers glowed around them, responding to Snowdrop's joy with cascades of prismatic light, Daniel knew that whatever storms might come, whatever challenges they might face, they would weather them together, just as they had weathered the blizzard that had nearly taken everything from Lyra, but had instead given them all a new beginning. Not cursed, but blessed, not lost, but found, not broken, but whole.